So after my first alternative video became popular, I thought of doing it again, but this time trying to become better at my videos, even if I get a dislike or two. At least I am willing to try to make something impactful on my videos that I am proud of, even if it doesn't reach the same levels as much higher YouTubers who do something similar to what I am doing. I hope you understand. Until then, I hope you like the video and enjoy what I have to say. Let's go.
Pokemon is one of the largest franchises in the world, with a lot of support and, to an extent, haters. The series has always captured people's imagination and shows us how to create a successful franchise. So let's do the unthinkable. What if Pokemon was a failure? Yes, Pokemon is a successful franchise, but in this alternate timeline, that doesn't matter because this one series would change the company that developed the game and the publisher that released it and the hardware that was on.
To understand why Pokemon became successful, we first need to look at how it became successful. The first factor was timing. The game was released in 1996 when most gamers were focused on the Nintendo 64 as their successor to the Super Nintendo. The Game Boy was in decline at this point, as many developers had shifted to making games for newer consoles. However, Game Freak, the developer of Pokemon, wanted to prove that the Game Boy still mattered, even though they nearly lost everything in the process. The second factor was its target audience. Pokemon was aimed at children, many of whom had grown up playing games like Mario or Kirby at their peak popularity. Meanwhile, older gamers were playing games like Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger. In Japan, series like Megami Tensei and Dragon Quest were keeping the RPG genre strong, but in the West, RPGs were not as popular. Most gamers, they preferred action or fighting games. Because of this, Pokemon's success was unusual. It managed to make the RPG genre popular with a new audience, even on a handheld system like the Game Boy. Now that you understand of everything I wrote down, the question on what if Pokemon was a failure, when I should have been the answer with what if Pokemon Red and Green was a failure. Let's say that it was released in December 1995, originally like they wanted it to, much like our timeline. The game doesn't start off successfully well, as the marketing didn't reach the Japanese public about the RPG collecting game. However, this alternate timeline, the game does much worse in sales, and as a result, Nintendo, Creatures slash Ape Inc. would remove their investment and future funding for Pokemon games as a one-off failure, while Game Freak, having already lost everything, would close their offices much like Takeru and EIM. And while the idea of playing with their friends via a link cable was a cool idea, it had already been done with other games in a smaller way. Even if it was original and groundbreaking, it doesn't mean success unless you have a larger successful release, which in this alternate timeline doesn't happen.
This also has an effect on Nintendo's future hardware in handhelds and later on consoles, because if Pokemon was a failure, then the Game Boy wouldn't have seen a resurrection of sales like in our timeline. And the worst, the Nintendo 64 would be placed in a tougher spot than our own timeline, with games being smaller and making less sales compared to the PlayStation, which was slowly taking over the generation. But wait, there's more. This would also give another company a chance to compete with Nintendo. Not Sega, because even then, Sega was already having problems. It was one of Nintendo's own creators that would basically undo their success in the handheld market. I am talking about the Wonder Swan. The Wonder Swan in our own timeline was a moderate hit in Japan, but wasn't able to bring the success it wanted in the long run due to, you guessed it, Pokemon. But in this alternate timeline, when its only game failed, the Game Boy is put into a tough spot. Even had Nintendo released the Game Boy Color, it really wouldn't have changed the fate of the Wonder Swan and its Color successor, as a number of third-party developers like Square had already left Nintendo even before the release of Pokemon, as the games like Final Fantasy would have been released for the Wonder Swan in our timeline. and had it been successful, it could have released in the West, with the color version being released in the West, even though the Game Boy brand is much stronger in general in both timelines. The difference here is that the WonderSwan would gain some gamers with games like Final Fantasy, Dragon Ball, One Piece, Mega Man, Dragon Quest, and Digimon. Another thing that might change is the culture mania. If Pokemon was a failure in our alternate timeline, then children would likely be focused on something else in video games, or find something outside of video games like cartoons or Japanese anime, which at the same time as Pokemon was becoming popular, so did anime, which in this alternate timeline, it still becomes popular but doesn't grow as fast in this alternate timeline, as is more general and slow, but that is just one scenario. As for Nintendo, this also would play a role into their hardware and would affect their software, as developers were mostly focused on the Nintendo 64, with the Game Boy not being a top priority, which in the original timeline, Pokemon would fill the void of Nintendo's other first-party games. However, in this alternate timeline, that doesn't happen, resulting in Nintendo management taking resources away from their console developers to try to make games for the aging Game Boy. And the Atlantis project, the successor to the Game Boy, it would come out much earlier than in our timeline and would still be called the Game Boy Advance. And would still do well, but with the sales being around 45 to 60 million units sold compared to the 82 million units that were sold in our timeline. There's also another scenario that it would happen in this alternate timeline, is that Pokemon characters in this alternate timeline wouldn't exist in Smash Bros. Because, well, the first and only game was a failure. So as a result, Smash for the Nintendo 64 would have 10 or 12 characters, with Bowser and King Dedede being playable instead. Of course, Smash Bros. Would still continue, which in our timeline is much like how Captain Falcon from F-Zero would be seen as a Smash character, even though he has his own game that Captain Falcon came from. The only good thing in this alternate timeline is that franchises like F-Zero, Kid Icarus, etc. would get second chances in this alternate timeline. Because Pokemon wasn't successful, this would give these franchises more love than our own timeline. Because while they didn't succeed at first, given that it was a failure, Nintendo would start to greenlight other franchises to give them a second chance, much like how they did with Metroid in the 2000s. I also believe that Rare would still be a second or even a first-party developer to this day, but much like our own timeline, they became mostly a smaller studio working on small projects for Nintendo's side series. Without the success of Pokemon, they wouldn't need Rare to be sold to outside companies like Microsoft or even Activision. To tell you the truth, I had to think a lot when I first wrote this down, because for me, I wanted to think of alternate scenarios and my thoughts to be original, as I had a lot in my head on crazier scenarios, and my success of the previous alternate video was a surprise for me. Given that I was expecting maybe 30 views in my lifetime, I wasn't even well known and wasn't even thinking of reaching 100 views to my knowledge. And to me, that's what made this possible, and your interest in the video is something that makes me want to do this in the first place. As usual, I want to thank you for watching the video, and until next time, bye.